In the quaint village of St. Mary Mead, a glamorous cooking show turns deadly when star chef André Dubois collapses, poisoned by a savoury tart. Was it the earnest baker Clara, desperate to win? The slick producer Reginald, chasing ratings? The vengeful rival chef Elise, consumed by a decades-old grudge? Or the pompous judge Sir Henry, guarding his pride? As whispers of envy and ambition swirl, only Miss Jane Marple, with her quiet knitting and sharper mind, can unravel the deadly recipe of motive and opportunity before the killer strikes again. Welcome to the Poisoned Cooking Show, where secrets simmer and truth cuts like a knife. Chapter 1. The stage is set. The late summer sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, where the village's usual tranquility had been disrupted by an event as rare as a comet. A televised cooking competition, the Great Village Feast, staged in the ancient timbers of the Assembly Hall. The hall, ordinarily host to parish meetings and the occasional jumble sale, had been transformed into a glittering stage of culinary ambition. Chrome-plated ovens gleamed under studio lights, and the air carried the mingled scents of fresh herbs and polished wood. Bunting in cheerful reds and blues draped the walls, lending a festive air to the proceedings, while a small but eager audience filled the rows of chairs, their murmurs rising like a gentle tide. Miss Jane Marple, seated primly in the front row, observed the scene with her customary quiet acuity. Her hands, delicate but steady, worked a pair of knitting needles. The soft click-clack of their rhythm, a counterpoint to the bustle around her. Her eyes, bright and bird-like behind her spectacles, missed nothing. The nervous fidgeting of a stagehand, the self-important stride of the show's producer, the gleam of anticipation in the villagers' faces. She had not come for the spectacle. Television, she felt, was often vulgar. But her neighbour, Mrs. Bantry, had insisted, and Miss Marple, ever curious about human nature, found herself intrigued by the prospect of drama, even if it was only of the culinary variety. At the heart of the stage stood Monsieur André Dubois, the renowned French chef whose name alone had drawn the television crew to this unassuming corner of England. André was a man of theatrical flourish, his moustache impeccably waxed, his chef's whites pristine despite the heat of the kitchen. His voice, rich with a Gallic cadence, boomed across the hall as he introduced the final contestant, Clara Henshaw, a local baker whose scones were the pride of St. Mary Mead. Clara, a slight woman with flour-dusted hands and a determined set to her jaw, stood at her station, arranging her ingredients with the precision of a surgeon. Her savoury tart, the culmination of weeks of competition, was to be the evening's pièce de résistance. Miss Marple's gaze flickered to the other figures on the stage. Sir Henry Worthington, the judge, sat at the tasting table, his portly frame straining against a tweed suit, his expression one of bored superiority. He had a reputation for sharp critiques, and his exchanges with André had been notably frosty. Beside him, the producer, Mr. Reginald Thorne, paced behind the cameras, his slick hair catching the light as he muttered instructions into a headset. Somewhere backstage, Miss Marple knew, lurked Madame Elise Fournier, a rival chef whose absence from the spotlight only heightened the whispers of her enmity with André. The village gossips had been busy, and Miss Marple, ever attuned to such currents, had heard tales of professional slights and simmering grudges. As Clara presented her tart, a golden pastry filled with a fragrant medley of roasted vegetables and herbs. The audience leaned forward, their anticipation palpable. André, with a dramatic flourish, cut a small slice and raised it to his lips. "Magnifique!" he declared, his eyes twinkling with approval. But as he chewed, his expression shifted. His hand flew to his throat, his face contorted in a grimace of pain. And with a strangled gasp, he collapsed onto the stage, his plate clattering to the floor. A collective gasp rose from the audience. Clara froze, her hands clutching her apron, while Sir Henry leapt to his feet, shouting for a doctor. Reginald Thorne barked at the crew to cut the cameras, but not before the chaos was broadcast to the world. Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. The tart, so carefully prepared, lay in pieces on the stage, its golden crust now an object of suspicion. A faint, bitter scent lingered in the air, unnoticed by most, but not by Miss Marple, whose senses were as sharp as her mind. As the crowd dissolved into murmurs and the village doctor pushed through to tend to André, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the patterns of human behaviour she knew so well. A collapse so sudden, so dramatic, suggested more than a mere mishap. She recalled a similar incident years ago when a vicar's wife had taken ill at a tea party, the result of a misdeed rooted in envy. Poison, she thought, was a coward's weapon, but a clever one. Her gaze swept the stage, lingering on Clara's stricken face, Sir Henry's bluster, Reginald's agitation, and the shadowed wings where Elise might be watching. Someone, she was certain, had orchestrated this moment. The police would come, of course, Inspector Craddock no doubt, with his methodical ways. But Miss Marple knew that the truth often lay in the small things. A glance, a gesture, a word unspoken. As the hall descended into pandemonium, she resumed her knitting, her mind already threading together the first strands of a mystery that promised to be as intricate as the lace shawl in her hands. Chapter 2. The Players in the Drama. The Assembly Hall in St. Mary Mead, so recently a stage for culinary triumph, had transformed into a sombre tableau of suspicion. The bright studio lights still burned, casting harsh shadows over the now silent ovens and scattered ingredients. But the festive air had evaporated like steam from a forgotten kettle. Monsieur André Dubois lay covered by a sheet, his theatrical presence reduced to a still form. As the village doctor, Dr. Haydock, confirmed what all feared, the chef was dead. The tart, that golden emblem of Clara Henshaw's hopes, was now sealed in a police bag, its savoury filling suspected of harbouring a deadly secret. Miss Jane Marple, seated unobtrusively in the front row, her knitting folded neatly in her lap, observed the scene with the quiet intensity of one accustomed to unravelling life's darker threads. Inspector Craddock arrived with his usual brisk efficiency, his notebook open and his expression one of controlled exasperation. A poisoning on live television was not the sort of case saint Mary Mead typically offered, and he knew the eyes of the nation, perhaps beyond, were watching. He conferred briefly with Dr. Haydock, whose preliminary examination suggested a swift-acting poison, likely an alkaloid, though tests would confirm the specifics. The inspector's gaze swept the hall, taking in the shocked audience, the frozen crew, and the four figures who now stood as the primary suspects in this grim drama. Miss Marple, though unnoticed by most, watched him closely, her mind already sorting the players in this unfolding mystery. The first suspect was Clara Henshaw, the local baker whose tart had delivered the fatal dose. A woman in her early 30s, Clara had the earnest demeanour of one who took pride in her craft. Her bakery, a modest establishment on the high street, was a village institution, its windows filled with scones and pastries that drew even the most discerning customers. Yet, as she stood by her cooking station, her apron stained with flour and her eyes red with unshed tears, she seemed less a perpetrator than a victim of circumstance. Miss Marple noted the tremble in Clara's hands, the way she clutched a wooden spoon as if it were an anchor. Could such a woman so devoted to her art have turned it to murder? Miss Marple thought of young Ellen, a maid from years past whose innocence had been questioned over a stolen brooch. Appearances, she knew, could deceive. Next was Mr. Reginald Thorne, the producer, whose sleek appearance and rapid-fire speech marked him as a man out of place in the village's quiet rhythms. He hovered near the cameras, his tailored suit creased from pacing, his fingers drumming a nervous tattoo on his clipboard. Reginald was a Londoner, brought to St. Mary Mead by the promise of a hit show that would elevate his career. The great village feast was his brainchild, and André's star power had been its draw. Yet, whispers among the crew suggested financial strain, a budget stretched thin, sponsors wavering. Miss Marple's sharp ears caught a stagehand's mutter about unpaid overtime, and she wondered if Reginald's ambition might have driven him to a desperate act. A scandal, after all, could boost ratings, even if it came at a terrible cost. Then there was Madame Elise Fournier, the rival chef whose absence from the stage was as conspicuous as André's presence had been. Elise, a woman of formidable reputation, ran a restaurant in a neighbouring town, its French-inspired menu a rival to André's own establishments. Her dark hair and piercing eyes were said to command a kitchen, as surely as a general commands an army. But her career had faltered in recent years, overshadowed by André's relentless success. The village gossips, ever reliable, spoke of a feud that stretched back decades. Stolen recipes, public slights, a rivalry that burned like a slow fuse. Elise had been backstage during the filming, her presence noted but her actions unverified. Miss Marple recalled a similar case, a vicar's sister driven to spite by years of resentment. Envy, she knew, could fester into something far darker. Finally, there was Sir Henry Worthington, the judge, whose pompous air and tweed-clad bulk dominated the tasting table. A local landowner with a taste for the finer things, Sir Henry had relished his role on the show, his critiques delivered with a relish that bordered on cruelty. His clashes with André were no secret. The Frenchman's flamboyance grated against Sir Henry's staid propriety, and their arguments had spiced the show's rehearsals with tension. Yet Sir Henry's wealth and status made a motive elusive. Why would a man of his standing risk such a crime? Miss Marple's mind turned to old Mr. Fortescue, a squire whose pride had once masked a surprising capacity for deceit. Power, she mused, could be its own poison. Inspector Craddock began his interviews, his questions sharp but methodical, as the audience was gently ushered out. Miss Marple, however, lingered, her presence so unassuming that no one thought to question it. She watched as Clara was questioned first, her voice breaking as she described her meticulous preparation. "I checked every ingredient," she insisted, her hands twisting her apron. "The vegetables, the herbs, they were fresh from the market. I tasted the filling myself before baking." Craddock nodded, his pen scratching notes. But Miss Marple caught the flicker of doubt in his eyes. Clara's access to the tart made her an obvious suspect, but her distress seemed genuine. Miss Marple thought of the village fete, where a tampered cake had caused a stir. The culprit had been clever, planting evidence to shift blame. Was someone doing the same here? Reginald was next, his answers glib but edged with unease. Andre was the heart of the show, he said, spreading his hands. His death is a disaster for us all. Yet, when pressed about the show's finances, his smile faltered, and he spoke vaguely of investor confidence. Miss Marple noted his quick glance toward the cameras, as if calculating their worth. A man so invested in appearances, she thought, might orchestrate a spectacle, even a deadly one. She recalled a theatre manager in St. Mary Mead, whose financial woes had led to a staged robbery. Reginald's motives, she suspected, lay in the ledger books he was so reluctant to discuss. Elise Fournier, summoned from backstage, swept into the hall with the air of a queen entering a battlefield. Her dark eyes flashed as she denied any involvement. "I was in my dressing room, preparing for my guest appearance," she said, her French accent clipped with indignation. "Andre was a rival, yes, but I am no murderer." Her alibi, however, was shaky. No one could confirm her whereabouts during the critical moments before the tart was served. Miss Marple observed the chef's hands, steady and calloused from years at the stove. Such hands, she thought, could wield a knife or a vial with precision. Elise's expertise with exotic ingredients, including rare herbs, was well known. Could one of those herbs have been more than culinary? Sir Henry, questioned last, was dismissive, his voice booming with the confidence of a man accustomed to command. "Ridiculous," he huffed, adjusting his cufflinks. "I barely touched the tart, and I certainly didn't poison it." Yet his disdain for Andre was evident, his words laced with contempt for the chef's continental theatrics. Craddock pressed him on their disagreements, and Sir Henry admitted to heated words over the show's direction. He wanted spectacle. I wanted tradition, he said, his jaw tight. Miss Marple noted a faint tremor in his voice, a crack in his polished facade. Pride, she knew, could drive a man to extremes, especially one who felt his authority challenged. As the interviews concluded, Craddock sealed off the stage, declaring it a crime scene. The tart, now in the hands of forensic experts, would reveal its secrets in time. But Miss Marple knew the truth lay not just in science, but in the human heart. She rose from her seat, her movements slow but deliberate, and made her way to the hall's exit, pausing to overhear a stagehand's whispered comment. Someone was in the pantry before the show. Sneaking about they were. The pantry, where Clara's ingredients had been stored, was unguarded for much of the day. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Opportunity, she thought, was as crucial as motive. Outside, the village was alive with speculation, the evening air thick with the scent of honeysuckle and the buzz of gossip. Mrs. Bantry, waiting by the hall steps, pounced on Miss Marple with eager questions. "Jane, what do you make of it? Poison, in our village. It's like something out of one of your novels." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her mind elsewhere. "People are much the same, Dolly," she said, her voice soft but firm. "In novels or in life, they act for reasons. Love, hate, fear, greed. We need only find which one." as she walked home, her shawl drawn against the evening chill. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the suspects. Clara's innocence seemed plausible, but her ingredients were vulnerable to tampering. Reginald's ambition burned brightly, perhaps too brightly to let a rival chef overshadow his show. Elise's grudge was a smouldering fire, fueled by years of professional slights. Sir Henry's pride, wounded by André's charisma, might have sought a drastic remedy. Each, in their way, reminded her of villagers she had known. The baker who hid his debts, the spinster who nursed a grudge, the squire who craved control. At her cottage, Miss Marple lit a fire, the crackle of logs a comforting counterpoint to the day's events. She settled into her armchair, her knitting resumed, but her mind was far from idle. The poison, Dr. Haydock had said, was likely an alkaloid, subtle and swift. Such a substance required knowledge and access, pointing to someone with culinary expertise, or a clever mind. She thought of the pantry, the unguarded ingredients, the fleeting figure the stagehand had seen. Someone had planned this act with care, weaving it into the chaos of a live broadcast. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, each stitch a step toward clarity. The stage was set, the players revealed, but the script of this drama was still unwritten. She would watch, listen, and piece together the truth, as she had so often before. In St. Mary Mead, where secrets hid behind lace curtains and polite smiles, Miss Marple knew that human nature was the key to unlocking even the deadliest of mysteries. Chapter 3. Clara's Tale. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Clara Henshaw's bakery, casting delicate patterns on the worn wooden counter where trays of fresh scones and pastries usually drew a steady stream of villagers. Today, however, the shop was shuttered. Its sign turned to closed in the wake of the tragedy at the great village feast. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat perched neatly on her head and her knitting bag tucked under her arm, stepped lightly across the high street, her eyes taking in the quiet village. St. Mary Mead was abuzz with whispers, but Clara's bakery, once the heart of morning chatter, stood silent, a testament to the shadow cast by André Dubois' death. Miss Marple knocked softly on the door, her touch gentle but insistent. After a moment, Clara appeared, her face pale and her apron dusted with flour, as if she had sought refuge in the familiar rhythm of her work. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling, "I didn't expect—" "Please, come in." She opened the door wider, revealing the cosy interior of the bakery, its shelves half empty and the air heavy with the scent of yeast and worry. They settled at a small table near the window, where Clara poured tea with hands that shook ever so slightly. Miss Marple observed her closely, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the way her fingers twisted a corner of her apron. Clara was a woman of quiet strength, her life built around the simple pride of her craft, yet now she seemed fragile, as if the weight of suspicion might crush her. "I can't believe it," Clara began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Monsieur André, dead, and my tart? They say it was poison, Miss Marple, but I swear, I'd never. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression one of gentle encouragement. "My dear, no one who knows you would think you capable of such a thing," she said, her tone soothing, but with a hint of probing curiosity. "But tell me, Clara, exactly how you prepared that tart. Every detail matters, you see." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes bright with the quiet intensity of one who understood that truth often hid in the mundane. Clara took a deep breath, as if steadying herself for a confession, though her words carried only earnestness. "It was my best recipe," she said. "A savoury tart with roasted vegetables, courgettes, peppers and onions, all from Mr. Giles's market stall. I used fresh thyme and rosemary and a bit of goat's cheese for richness. I made the pastry myself, just like always, with butter from Mrs. Carter's dairy." She paused, her brow furrowing. "I prepared everything in the Assembly Hall's kitchen, under those bright lights. The ingredients were delivered the morning of the show, and I checked them all myself. I even tasted the filling before I baked it. It was perfect, Miss Marple, I swear it." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles clicking softly as she drew a skein of wool from her bag, more to set Clara at ease than out of necessity. "And the ingredients, my dear, were they ever left unattended?" she asked, her voice mild but her question sharp. Clara's eyes widened, and she hesitated, as if the thought had only just occurred to her. "Well," she said slowly, "the pantry was busy, with crew and contestants coming and going. I left my station for a few minutes to fetch water from the tap at the back of the hall. But only for a moment. Surely no one could have—" Her voice trailed off, and Miss Marple saw the dawning fear in her eyes. The old lady's mind turned to a long-ago incident at the vicarage, where a jar of jam had been tampered with during a brief absence. Opportunity, she knew, was the accomplice of intent. "And did you notice anyone near your station, Clara? Anyone who seemed out of place?" she asked, her tone as casual as if she were inquiring about the weather. Clara frowned, her hands stilling on the teapot. I'm not sure," she said. "There was so much bustle. But I did see Madame Fournier backstage, talking to one of the stage hands. She looked angry, but she's always like that, isn't she? So fierce." Miss Marple's needles paused, though her expression remained unchanged. Elise Fournier's name, surfacing so soon, was a thread worth following. And the others, Mr. Thorne, Sir Henry, were they nearby? She prompted. Clara shook her head. Mr. Thorne was always shouting at the crew, running about with his clipboard. Sir Henry was at the judging table, but he came to the kitchen once, complaining about the noise. He didn't touch anything, though, I'm sure of it. Her voice wavered, and she looked at Miss Marple with pleading eyes. "You believe me, don't you? I only wanted to win, to show everyone what I could do." Miss Marple reached across the table, patting Clara's hand with a warmth that belied her keen scrutiny. "Of course, my dear," she said, though her mind was already weaving connections. Clara's sincerity rang true, much like young Mary, a housemaid once accused of theft, whose tears had hidden no guile. But the pantry's chaos, the unguarded ingredients, offered a window for mischief. Someone with knowledge and motive could have slipped a deadly substance into the tart's filling, knowing André would be the first to taste it. As she rose to leave, Miss Marple's eyes fell on a small jar of dried herbs on Clara's counter, labelled Time Local. She paused, her curiosity piqued. "These herbs, Clara, did you use them in the tart?" she asked. Clara nodded. "Yes, but they're just from Mr. Giles's stall, same as always. I've used them for years." Miss Marple smiled, filing the detail away. Herbs, she knew, could be more than they seemed. A case in Chipping Cleghorn had taught her that even the most innocent ingredients could mask a poisoner's art. Stepping back into the high street, Miss Marple felt the weight of the villagers' gaze, though few would guess the sharpness of her thoughts. Clara's tale was one of innocence, but innocence could be exploited. The pantry, the herbs, the fleeting presence of Elise Fournier, these were threads in a pattern not yet clear. Miss Marple recalled a conversation with her nephew Raymond, who had once laughed at her knack for seeing parallels in village life. "Aunt Jane," he'd said, "you find murder in a teacup." And so she did, for in the quiet lives of St. Mary Mead, she had learned that human nature was the same, whether in a grand city or a humble bakery. As she walked toward her cottage, her steps slow but purposeful, Miss Marple's mind turned to the other players. Reginald Thorne's ambition, Elise Fournier's grudge, Sir Henry Worthington's pride, each offered a motive, each a possibility. But it was Clara's tart, her pride and joy that had carried the poison. Someone had chosen her as their instrument, and Miss Marple was determined to discover who. The village clock chimed noon, its notes carrying across the green, and Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint, resolute smile. The truth, she knew, was like a recipe. It required patience, care, and a keen eye for the smallest ingredient. Chapter 4. The Producer's Ambition. The afternoon light filtered through the high windows of the St. Mary Mead Assembly Hall, now stripped of its festive bunting and reduced to a sombre crime scene. The gleaming ovens stood cold, their chrome surfaces reflecting the flickering shadows of police constables moving methodically about their tasks. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, had returned to the hall under the pretext of retrieving a forgotten knitting pattern. Though her true purpose was to observe the man whose ambition had brought the great village feast to the village, Mr. Reginald Thorne, the producer. She found him near the stage, his tailored suit slightly rumpled, his clipboard clutched like a shield, as he issued terse instructions to a harried cameraman. Reginald was a man of middle years, with the polished air of a city dweller who viewed St. Mary Mead as a quaint backdrop for his grand designs. His slicked-back hair and sharp features suggested a restless energy. But today that energy was frayed, his eyes darting as if expecting new trouble at any moment. Miss Marple approached with her usual unassuming grace, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice soft but clear, "I do hope I'm not interrupting. Such a dreadful business, this, and I imagine it's quite a strain on you." Reginald turned, his expression shifting from irritation to a practiced charm. "Miss Marple, isn't it? No trouble at all," he said, though his smile was tight. "It's a nightmare, of course. Andre was our star. Without him, the show—" He trailed off, shaking his head as if the thought were too grim to voice. Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes bright with quiet curiosity. "A great loss indeed," she said, "but surely a man of your talents will find a way to carry on. The show must be quite an undertaking." Her words, gentle as they were, carried a subtle probe, and Reginald seized the chance to talk, as ambitious men often did when flattered. "Oh, it's been a gamble from the start," he admitted, leaning against a prop table. "Bringing a show like this to a village, well, it's not exactly London, is it? But the authenticity, the charm of St. Mary Mead, that's what sold it to the sponsors. And Andre, of course, his name alone doubled our budget." He paused, his fingers tapping the clipboard. "Or it would have, if the sponsors hadn't started wavering." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she drew them from her bag, more to set him at ease than to knit. "Wavering?" she echoed, her tone one of polite concern. That must be trying, with so much at stake. Reginald's jaw tightened, and he glanced toward the crew, ensuring no one was within earshot. "Between you and me," he said, lowering his voice, "the show's been bleeding money. Sponsors want glamour, big names. Andre was our ticket, but he wasn't cheap. And now—" He gestured vaguely toward the stage, where Andre's absence was a palpable void. Miss Marple noted the nervous twitch in his fingers, the way his eyes avoided hers when he spoke of money. She thought of Mr. Hargreaves, a local shopkeeper who had once overstretched his finances and resorted to petty theft to cover his losses. Ambition, she knew, could push a man to desperate measures. "And yet," she said, her voice mild, "a scandal like this might draw attention to the show. Some might say it's good for ratings." She let the words hang, watching his reaction. Reginald's smile faltered, and for a moment his composure slipped, revealing a flicker of unease. "That's a grim way to look at it," he said, forcing a laugh. "I'd rather have Andre alive and cooking than deal with this mess. The police crawling everywhere, sponsors pulling out. It's a disaster." He straightened, as if to shake off the implication. "Besides, I was nowhere near Clara's station. I was with the crew, setting up the final shot. Ask anyone." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of innocent agreement, though her mind was cataloguing his words. His alibi was plausible, but alibis, she knew, could be crafted as carefully as a script. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a grocer's assistant had claimed to be busy in the back, while slipping arsenic into a customer's tea. Reginald's role gave him access to every corner of the set, including the pantry where Clara's ingredients had been stored. "Of course," she said, "you must have been terribly busy." "So many details to manage. Did you notice anything unusual before the tragedy? Anyone near the kitchen, perhaps?" Reginald frowned, as if searching his memory, but his answer came too quickly. "Not a thing. It was chaos, as always. Crew running about, contestants fussing over their dishes. I didn't have time to play watchdog." His tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple caught the slight tremor in his hand as he adjusted his tie. She smiled, her eyes crinkling with apparent warmth. "Naturally," she said, "you've enough to do without keeping track of everyone." As she spoke, her gaze drifted to the stage, where a constable was examining Clara's cooking station. The pantry door, just visible at the back, stood ajar, its contents now under police scrutiny. Miss Marple had overheard a stagehand earlier, muttering about someone sneaking about near the pantry before the show. Reginald, with his constant presence and authority, could have slipped in unnoticed. Or, she mused, he could have directed someone else to do so. She thought of a village fete years ago, where a committee chairman had orchestrated a theft to cover his debts, using an unsuspecting volunteer as his pawn. "Tell me, Mr. Thorne," she said, her tone as casual as if discussing the weather, "how well did you know Monsieur Dubois? He must have been a fascinating man to work with." Reginald's expression softened, though his eyes remained guarded. "Andre was a handful," he said, "brilliant, but demanding. Always pushing for more lights, more drama. He wanted the show to be his legacy, you know." Sometimes I wondered if he cared more about his image than the food. There was a hint of resentment in his voice, quickly masked by another forced smile. But that's show business. You take the egos with the talent. Miss Marple nodded, her needles moving steadily. Resentment, she knew, could simmer beneath the surface, especially when one man's ego threatened another's control. She recalled a local solicitor, Mr. Pennington, whose pride had led him to sabotage a rival's case out of sheer spite. Could Reginald, feeling overshadowed by Andre's charisma, have sought to reclaim his authority through a deadly act? The thought lingered as she rose, thanking him for his time. "You've been most helpful, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice warm but her eyes sharp. "I do hope this dreadful business is resolved soon." As she made her way out of the hall, Miss Marple paused by the pantry door, where a young constable stood guard. She smiled at him, her air so benign that he scarcely noticed her glance at the shelves within. Jars of herbs, bottles of oil, and bags of flour were neatly labelled, but one jar, a small one, half hidden behind a sack of sugar, caught her eye. It bore no label, its contents a fine greenish powder, unlike the thyme or rosemary Clara had described. Miss Marple made a mental note, her thoughts turning to the alkaloid Dr. Haydock had mentioned. Such a substance, she knew, could be concealed in something as innocuous as a spice jar. Outside, the village was settling into its evening rhythm, the air cool and fragrant with late summer blooms. Miss Marple walked slowly, her mind weaving the threads of what she had learned. Reginald's ambition was clear, his financial strain a motive that could not be ignored. His claim of being too busy to notice anything suspicious was convenient, perhaps too convenient. She thought of the stagehand's whisper, the unlabelled jar, the ease with which a man in charge could manipulate a chaotic set. Reginald Thorne, she decided, warranted closer attention. At her cottage, Miss Marple lit a lamp and settled into her armchair. Her knitting resumed, but her thoughts far from idle. The producer's ambition, like a fire stoked too high, could burn those around him. But was it he who had slipped poison into Clara's tart, or had he merely set the stage for another's act? The pattern was still forming, but Miss Marple knew that ambition, like envy, could twist even the most polished soul. She would watch, listen, and wait, for in St. Mary Mead the truth always surfaced, like cream rising in a churn. Chapter 5. The Rival's Grudge. The evening air in St. Mary Mead carried a faint chill, as if the village itself sensed the shadow cast by Andre Dubois' death. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl drawn tightly against the breeze, made her way to La Belle Assiette, the restaurant, owned by Madame Elise Fournier, located just beyond the village in the bustling market town of Much Benham. The establishment, with its crisp white tablecloths and flickering candles, exuded an air of continental sophistication that stood in stark contrast to the homely charm of Clara's bakery. Yet, as Miss Marple stepped inside, she sensed an undercurrent of tension, as if the restaurant's polished facade concealed a simmering unrest. Elise Fournier stood behind the counter, her dark hair pulled into a severe chignon, her eyes sharp as the knives lined up beside her. She was a woman of commanding presence, her movements precise as she arranged a tray of delicate pastries, though her expression betrayed a flicker of unease. The restaurant was nearly empty, save for a lone waiter polishing glasses in the corner, and Miss Marple noted the absence of the usual evening crowd. Gossip, it seemed, had already begun to erode Elise's trade. As whispers of her rivalry with André spread through the county. "Madame Fournier," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but clear as she approached, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. "I hope I'm not intruding. I was passing through and thought I might enjoy a cup of tea if you've a moment." Her tone was one of polite deference, but her eyes, bright behind her spectacles, missed nothing. The slight tightening of Elise's lips, the way her hands paused mid-motion. Elise's gaze flickered with suspicion, but she nodded, gesturing to a small table near the window. "Of course, mademoiselle," she said, her French accent thick with a mix of pride and weariness. "Tea, it is simple enough, please sit." As she prepared the pot, Miss Marple settled into the chair, her knitting needles emerging almost instinctively. The click-clack of their rhythm filled the quiet, a soothing counterpoint to the tension in the air. "I was so sorry to hear about Monsieur Dubois," Miss Marple began, her tone gentle but probing. "Such a terrible loss, and on your show, too. You must have known him well, being in the same trade." She let the words hang, her eyes fixed on Elise, who set the teapot down with a touch more force than necessary. "Well enough," Elise replied, her voice clipped. "André and I were colleagues of a sort. We trained in Paris years ago, under the same chef. But our paths diverged." Her lips curled into a faint, bitter smile. "He preferred the spotlight, the fame. I preferred the craft." She sat opposite Miss Marple, her posture rigid, as if bracing for an interrogation. Miss Marple sipped her tea, its warmth a contrast to the coolness of Elise's demeanour. "It must be difficult," she said, "to see another rise so high when your own work is so fine. I've heard such praise for your dishes, Madame Fournier." The compliment was genuine, but calculated, designed to loosen the chef's guard. Elise's eyes softened briefly, but the hardness returned as she spoke. "Praise does not fill tables," she said, her voice low. "André, he had the charm, the name. He took my recipes, my ideas, and made them his own. In Paris, he claimed my sauce veloutée as his creation. In London, he opened his restaurant with dishes I had perfected. And now, this show, his show, while my belle assiette struggles." Her hands clenched into fists, then relaxed, as if she had caught herself revealing too much. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her expression one of sympathetic interest. "How dreadful," she said. "Such slights must weigh heavily. And to think you were both part of the same show, yet he held the stage." She paused, as if struck by a thought. "Were you there, in the hall, when Clara's tart was prepared? It must have been quite a scene, with all the bustle." Elise's eyes narrowed, but she answered readily enough. "I was in my dressing room, preparing for my guest appearance. The producers wanted me to make a brief entrance, to add drama, they said." Her tone dripped with disdain. "I had no need to be in the kitchen. My work is here, not in some televised circus." Yet, as she spoke, Miss Marple noted a slight hesitation, a glance toward the window that suggested something unspoken. The old lady recalled Clara's mention of seeing Elise backstage, near the kitchen, her demeanour angry. She thought, too, of the stagehand's whisper about a figure near the pantry. "Of course," Miss Marple said, her voice mild. "You must have been terribly busy. But it's curious, isn't it, how such a thing could happen under so many eyes? The poison, I mean. It would take someone clever, someone who knew their way around a kitchen." Elisa's expression hardened, her hands folding tightly in her lap. "If you're suggesting I had anything to do with it, mademoiselle, you are mistaken," she said, her voice cold. "Andre was a thorn in my side, yes, but I am no poisoner. I fight my battles with my food, not with whatever killed him." She rose, as if to signal the end of the conversation, but Miss Marple remained seated, her needles pausing. "I'm sure you do," Miss Marple said, her tone as gentle as ever. "But you must know your herbs and spices, Madame Fournier. I've heard you're quite skilled with exotic ingredients. Such knowledge is a gift, but also a responsibility, don't you think?" Her words were soft, but they carried a weight that made Elise pause, her hand lingering on the teapot. "I know my craft," Elise said, her voice steady but her eyes wary. "Herbs, yes, spices, oils, bitters. I use them to create, not to destroy." She turned away, busying herself with the counter. But Miss Marple caught the faint tremor in her fingers. The mention of bitters, so casually dropped, had struck a nerve. And Miss Marple filed it away, thinking of the unlabeled jar in the pantry, its greenish powder, an enigma. As she finished her tea, Miss Marple's gaze wandered to a shelf behind the counter, where a row of bottles caught the light. Oils, vinegars, and a few small vials labelled as specialty bitters. One, she noted, bore a handwritten label in French, its contents dark and viscous. She thought of Dr. Haydock's mention of an alkaloid, a poison that could be distilled from certain plants, perhaps even disguised in a culinary ingredient. Elise's expertise, her access to such substances, made her a figure of interest, but Miss Marple knew better than to leap to conclusions. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a gardener's wife had used her knowledge of plants to deadly effect, her motive rooted in a long festering grudge. "Thank you for the tea, Madame Fournier," Miss Marple said, rising with a smile. "You've been most kind. I do hope your restaurant sees brighter days soon." Her words were sincere, but her eyes lingered on Elise, noting the tension in her shoulders, the way she avoided meeting her gaze. As Miss Marple stepped into the evening, the village lights twinkling like stars, she felt the threads of the mystery tightening. Elise's grudge against Andre was no mere professional rivalry. It was a wound that had bled for years, each slight a fresh cut. Her presence backstage, her knowledge of exotic ingredients, and her unguarded moment of anger all pointed to opportunity, if not intent. Yet Miss Marple knew that passion like a fire could blind as much as it illuminated. Was Elise the poisoner, or merely a woman whose pride had been trampled one time too many? The answer, she suspected, lay in the small details, the jar, the bitters, the fleeting figure in the pantry. As she walked back to St. Mary Mead, her steps slow but steady, Miss Marple's mind wove the strands of what she had learned. Clara's innocence, Reginald's ambition, and now Elise's grudge formed a tapestry of motives, each distinct yet intertwined. The village clock chimed, its notes carrying across the quiet green, and Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. The truth, she knew, was like a dish prepared with care. It required time, patience, and a keen sense for the subtlest flavours. Chapter 6. The Judge's Disdain. The morning mist clung to the rolling lawns of Worthington Hall, Sir Henry Worthington's imposing manor on the outskirts of St. Mary Mead. The house, with its ivy-clad walls and mullioned windows, stood as a testament to old money and older pride. its grandeur undimmed by the modern bustle of the village. Miss Jane Marple, her umbrella tucked under one arm and her knitting bag under the other, approached the wrought iron gates with the air of a visitor paying a neighbourly call. She had sent a note ahead, requesting a brief audience under the guise of discussing the village fete, but her true purpose was to probe the heart of the fourth suspect in Andre Dubois' murder. Sir Henry himself. A butler, stiff and formal, ushered her into a drawing-room adorned with heavy oak furniture and portraits of stern-faced ancestors. Sir Henry stood by a roaring fire, his portly frame clad in a tweed suit that seemed to strain at the seams, his ruddy cheeks flushed with either warmth or irritation. "Miss Marple," he boomed, his voice carrying the weight of a man accustomed to being heard. "A pleasure, though I can't imagine what brings you here in such troubled times. This business with Dubois, ghastly, simply ghastly." He gestured to a plush armchair, his manners polished but his eyes wary. Miss Marple settled into the chair, her knitting needles emerging with their familiar click-clack, a rhythm that seemed to soothe even the most guarded souls. "Indeed, Sir Henry," she said, her voice soft but clear. "A dreadful affair, and so public too. It must have been trying for you, sitting at the judging table when it happened." Her tone was one of gentle sympathy, but her eyes, bright behind her spectacles, watched him closely, noting the way his hand tightened on the mantelpiece. "Trying?" Sir Henry huffed, his moustache bristling. "It was an outrage, a man collapsing like that, in front of cameras no less. The whole thing's a disgrace to Saint Mary Mead." He paced a step, his heavy tread muffled by the thick carpet. "Dubois was a showman, not a proper chef. All flash and nonsense, French theatrics. I told Thorne we needed tradition, not some circus, but he wouldn't listen." His voice carried a note of disdain, sharp as a blade, and Miss Marple filed it away. She nodded, her needles moving steadily. "You must have found him difficult to work with," she said, her tone mild. "Such a strong personality. And you with your fine sense of propriety. I imagine you clashed often." Her words were carefully chosen, a gentle nudge to draw out more than he intended. Sir Henry's eyes narrowed, but he took the bait, as men of his sort often did when their pride was stroked. "Clashed? Ha! The man was insufferable," he said, settling into a chair opposite her. "Always preening, always demanding more lights, more flair. He wanted to turn the show into a spectacle, while I insisted on substance. Good, honest British cooking, that's what the audience wants, not his fussy sauces and foreign nonsense." His voice rose, then fell as he caught himself, his fingers adjusting his cufflinks with a nervous twitch. Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile, her eyes never leaving his face. "Quite so," she said. "And yet you were there, tasting his dishes, judging alongside him. It must have been galling to share the spotlight with such a man." She paused as if struck by a thought. "Were you near the kitchen at all, Sir Henry? Before the tragedy, I mean. So many people coming and going, it's a wonder anyone could keep track." Sir Henry's face reddened, and he leaned forward, his voice firm. "I was at the judging table, Miss Marple, as is proper. I had no business in the kitchen. That's for contestants and crew. I did go backstage once to complain about the noise. Those cameras and lights clattering about like a factory. But I didn't touch anything, if that's what you're implying." His tone was indignant, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of unease in his eyes, a shadow that belied his bluster. She thought of Mr. Fortescue, a squire from years past whose pride had masked a penchant for petty revenge. Sir Henry's disdain for André was palpable, but was it enough to drive him to murder? She recalled Dr. Haydock's mention of the alkaloid, a poison that could be concealed in something as refined as a culinary bitter. "Of course," she said, her voice soothing. "You're a man of position, Sir Henry, not one to meddle in such things. Though I did notice, at the hall, a bottle of bitters on your table. Quite an unusual choice for a judge, I thought." Sir Henry blinked, caught off guard. "Bitters?" he said, his tone defensive. "A habit of mine, nothing more. I keep a bottle for my digestion. Old family remedy, perfectly harmless." He rose, as if to signal the end of the conversation, and moved to a sideboard where a collection of bottles gleamed in the firelight. Among them, Miss Marple noted, was a small vial, its label faded, but its contents dark and oily, much like the one she had seen at Elise's restaurant. Her mind turned to the unlabeled jar in the pantry, its greenish powder a silent question. "You must know your flavours well," she said, her tone as innocent as if discussing a recipe. "Such knowledge is a gift, but it requires care, doesn't it? A drop too much of the wrong thing." She let the words trail off, watching as Sir Henry's hand paused on the sideboard, his back stiffening. "I know my limits," he said curtly, turning to face her. "And I know my place, Miss Marple. I'm no cook, nor a chemist. If you're fishing for something, you'd do better to look elsewhere." His words were sharp, but Miss Marple's smile remained serene, her needles clicking as if undisturbed by his tone. She rose, smoothing her shawl with a delicate hand. "Oh, I'm not fishing, Sir Henry," she said, "merely an old lady's curiosity. You've been most kind to indulge me." She moved toward the door, pausing to glance at a framed photograph on the wall. A younger Sir Henry, shaking hands with a dignitary at a county fair, his expression one of smug satisfaction. Pride, she knew, could be a dangerous thing, especially when challenged by a man like André, whose charisma had upstaged even the grandest of egos. As the butler showed her out, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the scene at the hall. Sir Henry's claim of staying at the judging table was plausible, but his visit backstage, however brief, offered opportunity. The bitters on his sideboard, like those in Elise's restaurant, suggested a knowledge of potent ingredients, and his disdain for André hinted at a motive deeper than mere professional disagreement. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a pompous churchwarden had tampered with a rival's hymnals out of sheer spite. Could Sir Henry's pride have driven him to a more lethal act? The mist had lifted as she stepped onto the gravel path, the manor looming behind her like a silent witness. The village lay quiet, its cottages glowing softly in the morning light, but Miss Marple's mind was far from still. Sir Henry's bluster, Elise's grudge, Reginald's ambition, and Clara's innocence formed a complex pattern, each thread distinct yet part of a larger design. The bitters, the pantry, the poison, each was a clue, waiting to be woven into the truth. As she made her way back to St. Mary Mead, her umbrella tapping lightly on the path, Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint, resolute smile. The judge's disdain, like a spice used too liberally, had revealed more than he intended. She would continue to watch, to listen and to knit, for in the quiet corners of human nature, the truth always lay waiting, as patient as an old lady with her needles. Chapter 7. Threads of Motive. The soft glow of lamplight bathed Miss Jane Marple's cottage in a cosy warmth, the crackle of the fire a gentle counterpoint to the patter of rain against the windows. Outside, St. Mary Mead lay hushed under a late summer drizzle, its lanes empty save for the occasional villager hurrying home. Within, Miss Marple sat in her favourite armchair, a pot of tea steaming on the table beside her, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm. The skein of wool in her lap, a soft grey, seemed to mirror the tangled threads of the mystery surrounding André Dubois' death, and her mind, sharp as ever, worked to unravel them. She had spent a day gathering impressions, Clara's earnest distress, Reginald's nervous ambition, Elise's smouldering grudge, and Sir Henry's prickly pride. Each suspect was a distinct strand in the pattern, yet none stood alone, their motives and opportunities intertwined like the stitches on her needles. Miss Marple sipped her tea, its warmth steadying her thoughts, and let her mind wander over the clues, as she often did when a case grew complex. The poison, an alkaloid according to Dr. Haydock, was the key, but its delivery, through Clara's tart, suggested a cunning hand, one that knew how to exploit the chaos of the television set. Clara, she mused, seemed the least likely culprit. Her bakery was her life, her tart a labour of love meant to showcase her skill, not end a man's life. Yet her ingredients had been vulnerable, left in an unguarded pantry where anyone could have tampered with them. Miss Marple recalled a village fete, years ago, where a jar of chutney had been laced with a sleeping draught, the culprit relying on the bustle of the event to escape notice. Clara's distress had been genuine, but innocence, Miss Marple knew, could be a mask or a tool for another's deception. Reginald Thorne's ambition was a brighter thread, vivid with the sheen of desperation. His show, teetering on the edge of financial ruin, needed a spectacle to survive. André's death, though a tragedy, had thrust the great village feast into the national spotlight, a grim boon for a man whose career hung by a thread. Miss Marple thought of Mr. Hargreaves, the shopkeeper who had staged a break-in to garner sympathy and sales. Could Reginald have orchestrated a poisoning for similar gain, using Clara's tart as his stage? His constant presence on set, his authority over the crew, gave him opportunity, but his glib denials suggested a man accustomed to deflecting scrutiny. Elise Fournier's grudge burned darker, a thread of deep smouldering red. Her rivalry with André, rooted in years of professional betrayal, was no mere spat. It was a wound that had festered, each of André's successes a fresh slight. Her expertise with exotic ingredients, her presence backstage, and the vial of bitters in her restaurant all pointed to a woman capable of turning knowledge into a weapon. Miss Marple recalled Mrs. Eldridge, a spinster who had poisoned a rival's roses out of envy, her calm demeanour hiding a heart consumed by resentment. Elise's anger was more overt, but no less dangerous. Sir Henry Worthington's pride was a heavier strand, woven with the weight of tradition and status. His disdain for André's flamboyance, his insistence on control, hinted at a man who brooked no challenge to his authority. The bottle of bitters on his sideboard, so like the one in Elise's restaurant, suggested a familiarity with potent substances, and his brief visit backstage offered a window for mischief. Miss Marple thought of Mr. Pennington, the solicitor whose pride had led him to sabotage a rival's case, his actions cloaked in righteous indignation. Could Sir Henry's need to assert dominance have driven him to a deadlier act? The fire crackled, and Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her eyes drifting to the window where rain streaked the glass. The alkaloid, she mused, was no common poison. It required knowledge, perhaps even access to rare plants or distilled extracts. The unlabeled jar in the pantry, with its greenish powder, lingered in her mind, as did the stagehand's whisper of a figure sneaking about before the show. Someone had planned this act with care, choosing Clara's tart to ensure André would be the first to taste it. The question was not just who, but why and how. She rose, moving to the small writing desk where she kept a notebook. Not for recording clues in the manner of Inspector Craddock, but for jotting down thoughts, fragments of village life that mirrored the case at hand. She wrote, Clara, innocence but vulnerable. Reginald, ambition, ratings. Elise, grudge, knowledge. Sir Henry, pride, control. Beside each, she added a question. Who was in the pantry? The answer, she suspected, would tie the threads together. Miss Marple returned to her chair, her thoughts turning to a similar case years ago, when a vicar's wife had fallen ill at a tea party, the result of a poisoned macaroon. The culprit, a quiet seamstress, had acted out of jealousy, her motive hidden behind a facade of meekness. The parallel was not exact, but it reminded Miss Marple that motives often lay buried, revealed only through careful observation. She considered the suspect's interactions with André, Clara's admiration, Reginald's dependence, Elise's hatred, Sir Henry's contempt. Each had a reason to wish him gone, but only one had acted. The rain slowed to a drizzle, and Miss Marple's gaze fell on the tea tray, where a small jar of honey sat beside the pot. Honey, she knew, could mask a bitter taste, much as a familiar ingredient could conceal a poison. The tart's filling, roasted vegetables, herbs, goat's cheese, offered ample opportunity to hide an alkaloid, its flavour blending seamlessly with the savoury notes. Whoever had poisoned it knew André's habits, knew he would taste it first, his theatrical flourish making him the perfect target. She thought of the set, its controlled chaos a perfect cover for a subtle act. The pantry, with its jars and bottles, was a treasure trove for a poisoner, and the stagehand's vague report suggested someone had taken advantage of it. Miss Marple's mind returned to Elise's bitters, Sir Henry's vial, and the unlabelled jar, each a potential vessel for the alkaloid. But motive, she reminded herself, was as crucial as means. Clara had none, or so it seemed. Reginald's ambition, Elise's grudge, and Sir Henry's pride offered stronger threads, but which was the one that snapped? As the fire burned low, Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her thoughts settling into a quiet resolve. The truth, she knew, was like her knitting, each stitch small, seemingly insignificant, but together forming a pattern that could not be undone. She would visit the village tomorrow, listen to the gossip at the tea shop, perhaps speak to the stagehand who had seen the figure in the pantry. The threads were there, waiting to be woven into a whole. She set her knitting aside and rose to prepare for bed. The cottage silent, save for the soft ticking of the clock. The mystery of André's death was a dark one, but Miss Marple had faced darkness before. In St. Mary Mead, Where secrets hid behind lace curtains and polite smiles, she knew that human nature was the truest guide. The poisoner, whoever they were, had left a trail, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, would follow it to the end. Chapter 8. The Poison Source. The morning sun broke through the clouds over St. Mary Mead, casting a soft light on the village green, where dew still clung to the grass. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat firmly in place and her knitting bag slung over her arm, walked with purpose towards the assembly hall. The events of the past days had woven a complex tapestry in her mind, and she felt the pattern nearing clarity. The death of Andre Dubois, the poisoned tart, the suspects with their tangled motives, all pointed to a single elusive truth: the source of the poison. Today, she hoped to find a thread that would tighten the weave. Inspector Craddock had sent word to her cottage, a courtesy born of their long acquaintance, with news of a breakthrough in the case. The poison, he confirmed, was a rare alkaloid, likely derived from a plant such as monkshood or foxglove, both known for their deadly potency. Its presence in Clara's tart suggested a deliberate act, not a mere accident of contaminated ingredients. Miss Marple, her mind sharp with the memory of past cases, knew that such a poison required both knowledge and access, narrowing the field to those with culinary expertise or cunning intent. At the hall, the air was heavy with the scent of dust and disuse, the once gleaming ovens now silent under police tape. Inspector Craddock greeted her with a nod, his expression a mix of respect and mild exasperation. "Miss Marple," he said, his notebook already open, "I should have known you'd turn up. You've a knack for being where things happen." His tone was wry, but his eyes held a glint of trust, for he had learned to value her insights, however unorthodox her methods. "I was merely passing by, Inspector," she replied, her voice mild as she adjusted her shawl. "But since I'm here, perhaps you could share what you've learned about the poison. It's such a curious thing, isn't it, to find something so deadly in a simple tart?" Her eyes, bright behind her spectacles, scanned the room, lingering on the pantry door, still ajar from the police's thorough search. Craddock sighed, flipping a page in his notebook. "It's an alkaloid, as I told you," he said, "fast-acting, tasteless in small doses, and easily masked by strong flavors like those in Clara's tart. The lab says it could come from a plant extract, possibly distilled into a powder or liquid. We're testing everything in the pantry, but so far nothing matches exactly." He gestured toward the stage, where a constable was cataloguing jars and bottles. "The trouble is, anyone could have slipped it into the filling during the chaos of the show." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles emerging with their familiar click-clack, a rhythm that seemed to steady her thoughts. "Anyone with access to the pantry, you mean?" she said, her tone gentle but pointed. "And with knowledge of such things. Not everyone would know how to handle an alkaloid, would they?" She thought of the unlabeled jar she had glimpsed, its greenish powder a silent question, and of the bitters on Sir Henry's sideboard and in Elise's restaurant. Craddock's brow furrowed. "True enough," he said. "We're looking at the contestants and crew, but Clara's the obvious one. She made the tart. Still, she swears she tasted the filling herself, and she's not dead, so—" He shrugged, his frustration evident. Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. Clara's innocence, she felt, was likely genuine, but the pantry's vulnerability offered a window for another's hand. As they spoke, a young stagehand, a lad named Tommy Pierce, approached with a nervous shuffle. Miss Marple recognized him from the village, a boy known for his sharp eyes and tendency to linger where gossip was thickest. "Inspector," he said, glancing at Miss Marple with a mix of awe and unease, "I thought you should know. I saw something odd before the show. Someone was in the pantry, poking about. I couldn't see who, not clearly, but they were quick, like they didn't want to be noticed." Miss Marple's needles paused, her attention sharpening. "How very interesting, Tommy," she said, her voice soft but encouraging. "And where were you when you saw this figure?" Tommy scratched his head, his cheeks reddening. "I was by the back door, fixing a loose cable. It was just a glimpse, mind you, through the pantry window. Could have been anyone. Contestant, crew, even one of the judges." His eyes darted to Craddock, as if seeking approval. Craddock scribbled a note, his expression intent. "Can you describe them at all? Man, woman, tall, short?" Tommy shook his head. "Too dark, sir. They moved fast, like I said. But they were near Clara's station, where her herbs and such were kept." Miss Marple's mind turned to the unlabeled jar, its contents a potential key. She thought of a case in St. Mary Mead, where a shadowy figure seen near a vicarage garden had led to the discovery of a poisoned well. Shadows, she knew, often hid the truth. "Thank you, Tommy," she said, her smile warm. "You've been most helpful." As the boy retreated, she turned to Craddock. "The pantry seems quite central, doesn't it? So many eyes, yet so little seen." She moved toward the door, her steps slow but deliberate, and peered inside. The shelves were lined with familiar ingredients, flour, sugar, oils. But the unlabeled jar was gone, likely taken for testing. She made a mental note to inquire about its contents when the lab results came through. Craddock followed her gaze. "We're checking every jar, every bottle," he said. "If the poison came from here, we'll find it. But I'll be honest, Miss Marple, this feels like a needle in a haystack." She nodded, her expression serene. "Needles are my specialty, Inspector," she said, her tone light but her eyes sharp. "They're small, but they always leave a mark." As she left the hall, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the suspects. Clara's ingredients, so carefully chosen, had been the perfect vehicle for the poison, but her lack of motive made her an unlikely culprit. Reginald's ambition could have driven him to stage a scandal, his access to the set unquestioned. Elise's grudge and expertise with exotic ingredients made her a formidable suspect, her presence backstage a damning detail. Sir Henry's pride and his bottle of bitters suggested a subtler possibility, his brief visit to the kitchen a moment of opportunity. Yet, the alkaloid source was the key. Miss Marple recalled a conversation with her gardener, Mr. Pegg, who had once warned her about the dangers of foxglove in her borders. Such plants, common in English gardens, could be distilled into a deadly extract, especially by someone with knowledge of chemistry or cuisine. Elise's restaurant, with its array of bitters, came to mind, as did Sir Henry's vial, its contents suspiciously similar. But the pantry's unlabeled jar, glimpsed only briefly, hinted at a more direct route, a poison prepared and placed with precision. She paused on the village green, her umbrella shielding her from the light drizzle that had returned. The stagehand's sighting, vague though it was, confirmed her suspicion that the pantry was the heart of the crime. Someone had slipped in, unseen by most, and tampered with Clara's ingredients. The question was not just who, but how they had acquired the alkaloid. Miss Marple thought of the local apothecary, Mr. Jenkins, whose shop stocked herbal remedies alongside more conventional medicines. A visit there, she decided, might shed light on who had sought such a substance. As she made her way home, her steps steady despite the uneven path, Miss Marple's mind wove the clues into a tighter pattern. The poison's source was no mere detail. It was the thread that would lead to the killer. Clara's innocence, Reginald's ambition, Elise's grudge, Sir Henry's pride. Each was a motive, but only one had been paired with the means to act. She recalled a case in Chipping Cleghorn, where a chemist's assistant had supplied a poison under the guise of a remedy, his motive hidden in a web of greed. The parallel was not exact, but it sharpened her resolve. At her cottage, Miss Marple lit a fire, the warmth easing the chill of the day. She settled into her armchair, her knitting resumed, but her thoughts were far from idle. The alkaloid, the pantry, the shadowy figure, these were the pieces of a puzzle that, once assembled, would reveal the truth. She would speak to Mr. Jenkins tomorrow, listen to the village gossip, and watch for the small signs that betrayed a guilty heart. In St. Mary Mead, where secrets were as common as roses, Miss Marple knew that patience and observation would unravel even the deadliest of knots. Chapter 9. A Village Secret. The high street of St. Mary Mead shimmered under a midday sun, its cottages and shops bathed in a golden light that belied the dark undercurrent of André Dubois' death. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat tilted against the glare, made her way to the village tea shop, a hub of gossip as reliable as the church clock. The bell above the door jingled as she entered, and Mrs. Price, the shoe-eye proprietress, greeted her with a knowing smile. "Miss Marple, you're a sight for sore eyes," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "The village is all aflutter with this dreadful business. Tea, as usual?" Miss Marple nodded, settling at a corner table where she could observe the room, her knitting bag at her side. The tea shop was a microcosm of St. Mary Mead, its tables filled with villagers exchanging whispers over scones and cups of Earl Grey. Miss Marple's presence, unassuming as it was, drew little attention, which suited her perfectly. Her needles clicked softly, a rhythmic backdrop to the hum of conversation, and her ears, sharp as ever, caught fragments of talk about the cooking show, the poison, and the suspects. She knew that gossip, though often muddled, held kernels of truth, and in a village like St. Mary Mead, those kernels could lead to a murderer. At a nearby table, Mrs. Bantry, her friend and confidant, was holding court with two other women, their voices low but animated. "It's that Frenchwoman, mark my words," said Mrs. Bantry, her eyes wide. "Elise Fournier. She's got a temper like a storm, and everyone knows she hated André. My maid heard she was in a right state at the hall, arguing with someone before the show." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind latching onto the detail. Clara had mentioned seeing Elise backstage, angry, and now this. A pattern, she thought, was beginning to form. She sipped her tea, her eyes drifting to another table where young Tommy Pierce, the stagehand, sat with a cup of cocoa, his face flushed as he spoke to a friend. "I told the inspector," he said, his voice carrying just far enough. "Someone was in the pantry, sneaking about." I didn't see who, but it was odd, wasn't it? Right before poor Clara's tart went out." Miss Marple noted the lad's earnestness. So like young Jimmy, a delivery boy who had once stumbled on a clue to a theft in the village. Tommy's sighting, vague though it was, pointed to the pantry as the heart of the crime, and Elise's presence backstage made her a figure of growing interest. Mrs. Price approached with a fresh pot of tea, her face alight with the eagerness of one who thrived on village news. "Miss Marple," she said, leaning close, "they're saying Madame Fournier's restaurant is in trouble. Debts piling up, customers staying away. My cousin's boy works at the bank, and he says she's missed payments on her loan. And then there's that business with the apothecary." She lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Mrs. Jenkins told me Elise was in her shop last week, buying herbs. Strange ones, not for cooking, she said." Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her expression remained serene. "How curious," she said, her tone mild. "Herbs, you say? For her restaurant, perhaps?" Mrs. Price shook her head. "Not likely. Mrs. Jenkins said they were for remedies. But who needs? Foxglove or monkshood for a cold? Sounds fishy to me." She bustled off to serve another customer, leaving Miss Marple to ponder this new thread. Foxglove and monkshood, both sources of alkaloids, as Dr. Haydock had described. The connection was too neat to ignore. She recalled her visit to Elise's restaurant, the vials of bitters on the shelf, the chef's guarded demeanour when questioned about her ingredients. Now, this talk of apothecary purchases added weight to her suspicions. Miss Marple thought of a case in St. Mary Mead, where a herbalist's wife had used her knowledge of plants to poison a rival's tea, her motive buried in years of quiet resentment. Elise's grudge against André, coupled with her expertise, made her a formidable suspect. But Miss Marple knew better than to leap to conclusions. The truth, she had learned, was often obscured by the obvious. Rising from her table, Miss Marple decided to visit Mr. Jenkins's apothecary, a small shop tucked between the butcher and the post office. The bell above the door tinkled as she entered, and Mr. Jenkins, a wiry man with spectacles perched on his nose, looked up from his counter. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice warm but cautious. "What brings you here? Not feeling under the weather, I hope?" She smiled, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side. "Oh no, Mr. Jenkins," she said. "I was merely curious about some herbs. I've heard you stock quite a variety, even the more unusual ones." Mr. Jenkins's brow furrowed, but he nodded, leading her to a shelf lined with jars and packets. "We do, for those who know their uses," he said. "Herbal remedies mostly, though some are for cooking. Why do you ask?" Miss Marple's eyes scanned the shelves, noting labels for chamomile, lavender, and there, in a corner, a small jar marked Digitalis purpurea, the Latin name for foxglove. "Just an old lady's interest," she said, her tone light. "I heard Madame Fournier was here recently, buying herbs. It must be fascinating, supplying a chef of her caliber." Mr. Jenkins hesitated, his fingers adjusting his spectacles. "She was in, yes," he said, "last week, I think. Wanted some odd things. Foxglove, monkshood. Said it was for a special tea she was experimenting with. I warned her they're dangerous, but she's a professional, isn't she? Knows her way around a kitchen." He paused, his voice dropping. "After what happened to that chef, though, I've been wondering. Should I tell the inspector?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a reassuring sound as she met his gaze. "I'm sure you'll do what's right, Mr. Jenkins," she said. "The police will want to know everything, no matter how small." She thanked him and stepped back into the street, her mind racing. Elise's purchase of foxglove and monk's hood, both potential sources of the alkaloid, was a damning clue, but it was not proof. Anyone with access to the pantry could have used such a substance, and the unlabeled jar she had seen suggested a more direct method of delivery. As she walked toward her cottage, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the other suspects. Clara's innocence seemed more certain with each passing day, her tart a mere vehicle for another's malice. Reginald's ambition, while compelling, lacked the specificity of Elise's knowledge and opportunity. Sir Henry's pride and his bottle of bitters remained a possibility, but his motive felt less personal than Elise's deep-seated grudge. The stagehand's sighting of a figure in the pantry, combined with Elise's apothecary visit, pointed to her as the strongest thread. Yet Miss Marple knew that appearances could deceive. She recalled a conversation with her nephew Raymond, who had once teased her for finding murder in every village quarrel. "Aunt Jane," he'd said, "you see villains in the vicarage." And so she did, for in St. Mary Mead the smallest secrets could lead to the darkest deeds. Elise's financial troubles, her rivalry with André, her expertise with herbs, all wove a compelling case, but Miss Marple needed more. A visit to the assembly hall, perhaps, to see if the police had identified the contents of the unlabeled jar, or a quiet word with Tommy Pierce to clarify his sighting. At her cottage, Miss Marple lit a fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. She settled into her armchair, her knitting resumed, but her mind was far from idle. The apothecary's revelation was a vital thread, but it was not the whole pattern. Elise's anger, her access, her knowledge, all pointed to guilt. But Miss Marple knew that truth required patience. She would listen to the village's whispers, watch for the small signs, and let the threads of motive and opportunity guide her to the killer. In St. Mary Mead, where gossip was as potent as any poison, the truth was never far from the surface. Chapter 10. The Final Act. The assembly hall in St. Mary Mead stood silent under a grey afternoon sky, its once festive air replaced by an oppressive stillness that seemed to cling to the very walls. The police tape had been removed, but the stage, with its cold ovens and abandoned props, bore the weight of André Dubois' death, like a stage set for a tragedy. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl drawn tightly against the autumnal chill, had requested a gathering of the suspects: Clara Henshaw, Reginald Thorne, Elise Fournier, and Sir Henry Worthington, under the pretext of assisting Inspector Craddock with clarifications. The inspector, though sceptical of her methods, had agreed, knowing her knack for unearthing truths hidden in plain sight. The four suspects now stood or sat uneasily around the judging table, their faces a study in tension, while Miss Marple, her knitting bag at her side, took her place near the edge of the stage, her presence as unassuming as a shadow. Inspector Craddock, his notebook in hand, opened the proceedings with a brisk summary of the facts. "We know Monsieur Dubois died from an alkaloid poison, likely foxglove or monk's hood, slipped into Miss Henshaw's tart," he said, his voice steady but firm. "The poison was fast-acting, masked by the tart's flavours, and required both knowledge and opportunity. We've tested the pantry's contents, and one item, a small unlabeled jar of greenish powder, contained traces of the alkaloid. Someone here knows more than they've told. His eyes swept the group, lingering on each face. But it was Miss Marple's quiet gaze that seemed to pierce the deepest. She cleared her throat, her voice soft but carrying the weight of certainty. "It's a curious thing, isn't it?" she began, her knitting needles clicking gently. "How a village like St. Mary Mead can seem so simple, yet hide such dark deeds. I've been thinking about this case, and it reminds me of a time when a young woman in our parish poisoned a rival's jam out of envy. The motive, you see, is often personal, rooted in something deep and raw." Her eyes moved from one suspect to another, her tone as mild as if discussing the weather. Clara Henshaw, pale and trembling, clutched her apron. "I've said it before, Miss Marple," she pleaded. "I didn't do it. My tart was perfect. I tasted the filling myself. Someone must have tampered with it." Her voice broke, and Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle sympathy. "Indeed, my dear," she said, "your sincerity is clear. As it was to me at your bakery. But your ingredients were left in the pantry, unguarded, were they not?" Reginald Thorne, his suit creased from nervous pacing, interjected with a forced laugh. "This is absurd," he said, his hands gesturing expansively. "Why would anyone risk their career, my show, for something so reckless? I was with the crew, setting up shots nowhere near the pantry." His eyes darted to Craddock, seeking confirmation, but Miss Marple noted the slight sheen of sweat on his brow, a telltale sign of unease. Elise Fournier stood apart, her dark eyes flashing with defiance. "You look at me, I suppose," she said, her French accent thick with indignation, "because André and I were rivals? I was in my dressing room, preparing for my appearance. I had no reason to touch that girl's tart." Her voice was steady, but Miss Marple caught the way her fingers tightened on the edge of the table, as if bracing for a storm. Sir Henry Worthington, his tweed suit as imposing as his demeanour, huffed loudly. "This is preposterous," he boomed. "I'm a judge, not a cook. I was at the table, doing my duty, not skulking about in pantries. Dubois was a nuisance, yes, but I'd hardly stoop to murder." His cheeks reddened, but Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him, noting the defensive edge to his bluster. She set her knitting aside, her hands folding neatly in her lap. "Let us consider the facts," she said, her voice calm but commanding attention. "The poison, an alkaloid, was in an unlabeled jar in the pantry, a jar I saw myself. It was not among Clara's usual ingredients, which suggests it was placed there deliberately. Someone knew André would taste the tart first, his flair for drama making him the perfect target. And someone had the knowledge to use such a poison, which is not easily come by." Her eyes moved to Elise, whose face remained impassive, but whose posture stiffened. "Madame Fournier," Miss Marple continued, "you were seen backstage near the kitchen before the show. Young Tommy Pierce mentioned it, and Clara saw you too, looking angry. You've a history with André. Stolen recipes, public slights, a rivalry that cost you dearly. Your restaurant, I hear, is struggling, and André's success on the show only widened that gap." She paused, letting the words settle. "And then there's the matter of the apothecary. Mr. Jenkins told me you bought foxglove and monkshood last week, claiming it was for a special tea. Curious, isn't it, that such plants match the poison found?" Elise's eyes blazed, but her voice was cold. "You accuse me based on gossip," she said. "Yes, I bought herbs, as I often do. My restaurant uses many ingredients, and I experiment with flavors. But I did not poison André. I was not in the pantry." Her denial was fierce, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremble in her hands, a crack in her formidable facade. Miss Marple turned to Reginald. "Mr. Thorne, your show was in financial trouble, was it not? Sponsors wavering, budgets stretched thin. André's death, tragic though it is, has made the Great Village Feast a sensation. A scandal can boost ratings, as you well know, and as producer, you had access to every corner of the set, including the pantry." Reginald's face paled, his smile faltering. "That's a leap, Miss Marple," he said. "I'd never risk my career like that." "And you, Sir Henry," she continued, her gaze steady, "had your own reasons to resent André. His flamboyance clashed with your sense of tradition, and your arguments were no secret. You were backstage briefly, complaining about the noise, and your sideboard holds a bottle of bitters, much like those in Madame Fournier's restaurant. Such substances can hide a poison, can they not?" Sir Henry's moustache bristled, but he remained silent, his eyes narrowing. Miss Marple rose, her small figure commanding the room. "But the truth lies in the details," she said. "The apothecary receipt, found in Madame Fournier's dressing room, confirms her purchase of foxglove. Tommy Pierce's sighting places her near Clara's station, where the unlabeled jar was found. And the poison so carefully chosen required a chef's knowledge to blend into the tart's flavors without detection." She turned to Elise, her voice softening but unyielding. "Madame Fournier, your hatred for André consumed you. You saw him stealing your spotlight once more, threatening your legacy. You slipped the alkaloid into Clara's tart, knowing André would taste it first, to eliminate your rival and reclaim your fame." Elise's face drained of colour, her hands gripping the table as the room fell silent. For a moment, she stood rigid, her eyes locked on Miss Marple's. Then, like a dam breaking, her shoulders slumped, and her voice, barely a whisper, carried the weight of defeat. "He took everything," she said, her accent thick with emotion. "My recipes, my reputation, my life's work. I thought, if he was gone, I could breathe again." She sank into a chair, her confession a quiet surrender. Inspector Craddock stepped forward, his expression grim but satisfied. "Madame Fournier, you'll need to come with us," he said, motioning to a constable. Elise rose, her head high despite her defeat, and allowed herself to be led away. Clara let out a sob of relief, while Reginald shook his head, muttering about the show's future. Sir Henry, his bluster subdued, merely stared at the floor. Miss Marple gathered her knitting, her work done. The pattern, once tangled, had resolved into a clear design, each thread, motive, opportunity, evidence, woven into the truth. As she stepped toward the door, Craddock caught her eye. "You've done it again, Miss Marple," he said, a grudging smile tugging at his lips. She inclined her head, her smile faint but knowing. "Just an old lady's observations, Inspector," she said. "People are much the same, wherever you go." Outside, the village lay quiet, its secrets laid bare. Miss Marple walked home, her steps light despite the weight of what she had uncovered. The final act had played out, but the stage of human nature, she knew, would always hold new dramas, waiting for her quiet eye to unravel. Chapter 11. The Curtain Falls. The late afternoon light cast long shadows across the cobblestone lanes of St. Mary Mead, where the village seemed to exhale a collective sigh of relief. The assembly hall, so recently a stage for tragedy, stood empty, its doors locked and its once vibrant set dismantled, as if the village wished to erase the memory of André Dubois' death. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped lightly over her shoulders, walked slowly toward her cottage, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side. The resolution of the case, with Elise Fournier's confession, had restored a semblance of order. But Miss Marple knew that in a village like St. Mary Mead, the ripples of such an event would linger, like the scent of rain after a storm. At the police station, Elise had been formally charged, her proud demeanour crumbling into a quiet resignation as she recounted her actions. She had admitted to slipping the alkaloid, distilled from foxglove purchased at Mr. Jenkins's apothecary, into Clara's tart, using the chaos of the television set to mask her movements. Her motive, as Miss Marple had deduced, was rooted in a deep-seated grudge against André, whose theft of her recipes and spotlight had driven her to a desperate act. The unlabeled jar in the pantry, she confessed, was her own, placed there to hold the deadly powder until the moment was right. Inspector Craddock, meticulous as ever, had secured the evidence, and the case was closed, though not without a certain weariness in his eyes. Miss Marple paused at the village green, where a group of children played, their laughter a sharp contrast to the sombre mood of the past days. She thought of Clara Henshaw, whose tearful relief at being exonerated had been palpable in the assembly hall. The young baker had returned to her shop, determined to reopen and reclaim her reputation. Miss Marple had visited her that morning, finding her kneading dough with renewed vigour, her smile tentative but genuine. "I can't thank you enough, Miss Marple," Clara had said, her hands dusted with flour. "I thought my life was over." Miss Marple had patted her arm, her voice gentle. "You've a gift, my dear. Use it well, and the village will forget this trouble." She knew Clara would recover, much like young Mary, a maid who had once been falsely accused of theft, but went on to thrive. Reginald Thorne, too, had been in her thoughts. The producer, shaken by the scandal but quick to see opportunity, had already begun planning a new season of the Great Village Feast, this time with a focus on redemption and resilience, as he put it to a reporter from the local paper. Miss Marple, reading the article over her morning tea, had noted his slick recovery, his ambition undimmed by the tragedy. She thought of Mr. Hargreaves, the shopkeeper who had turned a crisis into profit, and wondered if Reginald's motives were as pure as he claimed. His financial strain, she suspected, would bear watching, though for now he was free to spin his tale of triumph. Sir Henry Worthington, chastened by the ordeal, had surprised Miss Marple with a private admission. In a letter delivered to her cottage, he confessed to tampering with the show's scores, favouring contestants whose dishes aligned with his traditional tastes. It was a small thing, he wrote, his handwriting as stiff as his demeanour. But I see now it was wrong. I had no part in Dubois's death, but I regret my actions. Miss Marple, reading the letter by her fire, had nodded to herself. Pride, she knew, could lead to small sins as well as great ones, and Sir Henry's confession, though not criminal, revealed a man humbled by the truth. She thought of Mr. Pennington. the solicitor whose pride had once led to deceit, and hoped Sir Henry would learn from his lapse. As she reached her cottage, Miss Marple paused to admire her roses, their petals vibrant despite the fading summer. The village, too, would bloom again, its wounds healing as gossip turned to newer tales. She entered her parlour, lighting a lamp against the Echinai gathering dusk, and settled into her armchair. Her knitting needles emerged, their click-clack a soothing rhythm, as she reflected on the case. Elise's confession had tied the threads together. The apothecary receipt, the unlabelled jar, the stagehand sighting. But it was the motive, that deep well of envy and loss, that had driven her to act. Miss Marple recalled a case in Chipping Cleghorn, where a woman's resentment had led to a similar act of poison, and knew that human nature, in its passions and frailties, was the true constant. The fire crackled, casting a warm glow over the room, and Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Inspector Craddock. He had stopped by earlier, his hat in hand, to thank her for her help. "You've a way of seeing things, Miss Marple," he said, a grudging smile on his face. "I'd have got there eventually, but you made it quicker." She had smiled, offering him tea, and said only, "It's just a matter of listening, Inspector. People tell you more than they realize." He had left with a shake of his head, muttering about her village wisdom. But Miss Marple knew it was no such thing. It was observation, honed over years in a place where secrets hid behind every lace curtain. She set her knitting aside, her eyes drifting to the window where the village lay quiet under a starry sky. The curtain had fallen on this particular drama, but St. Mary Mead, like any stage, would see new acts, new players. Miss Marple knew she would be there, watching from the wings, her quiet presence a safeguard against the darkness that lurked in even the smallest hearts. For now, though, she was content to let the village rest, its order restored, its secrets laid bare. Chapter 12. Reflections by the Fire. The first breath of autumn had settled over St. Mary Mead, its chill seeping through the cracks of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, where a fire blazed merrily in the grate. The parlour, with its chintz curtains and polished oak furniture, was a haven of warmth and familiarity, a stark contrast to the turmoil that had gripped the village in the wake of André Dubois' death. Miss Marple sat in her armchair, a shawl draped over her shoulders, her knitting needles moving with their steady rhythm, as a pot of tea steamed on the table beside her. Outside, the wind whispered through the bare branches, but within all was calm, the mystery resolved, the truth laid bare. She gazed into the fire, its flames casting dancing shadows on the walls, and let her mind wander over the events of the past days. Elise Fournier's confession had brought the case to a close, her admission of poisoning Clara's tart with a foxglove-derived alkaloid, tying together the threads Miss Marple had so carefully followed. The apothecary receipt, the unlabelled jar in the pantry, the stagehand's fleeting glimpse of a figure backstage, all had pointed to Elise, whose grudge against André had festered into a deadly act. Yet, as Miss Marple's needles clicked, she reflected not on the mechanics of the crime, but on the human frailties that had driven it. Envy, she mused, was a poison as potent as any alkaloid. Elise's hatred, born of years of professional slights, had consumed her, much as it had Mrs. Eldridge, the spinster who poisoned a rival's roses in a long-ago village quarrel. Miss Marple had seen it before, in the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead, where pride, ambition, and resentment could twist even the most refined souls. Elise's act was not just a crime, but a tragedy, a life undone by the weight of her own bitterness. She sipped her tea, its warmth a comfort against the evening's chill, and thought of the other players. Clara Henshaw, now free of suspicion, had reopened her bakery, her scones once again drawing villagers to her shop. Miss Marple had stopped by that morning, finding Clara's smile brighter, though still touched by the shadow of the ordeal. "I'm baking again, Miss Marple," she had said, her hands busy with dough. "It's what I know, what I love." Miss Marple had nodded, seeing in Clara the resilience of youth, like young Mary, the maid who had risen above false accusations to build a new life. Reginald Thorne, ever the opportunist, had turned the scandal to his advantage, his new season of the Great Village Feast already generating buzz in the papers. Miss Marple, reading his latest interview, had noted his slick assurances of honouring André's legacy, though she suspected his true loyalty lay with his own ambition. She thought of Mr. Hargreaves, the shopkeeper who had spun a crisis into profit, and wondered if Reginald's drive would one day lead him into darker waters. For now, he was merely a man of his time, chasing fame in a world that rewarded spectacle. Sir Henry Worthington's confession of tampering with the show's scores had surprised her, though not entirely. His pride, so like Mr. Pennington's in its rigidity, had led him to small deceptions, but not to murder. His letter, still tucked in her desk, was a rare glimpse of humility, a crack in the facade of a man who valued control above all. Miss Marple had written a brief reply, encouraging him to make amends, and she hoped he would heed her words. Pride, she knew, could be mended if the heart was willing. The fire crackled, and Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the village itself. St. Mary Mead, with its rose-covered cottages and gossip-filled tea shops, was a microcosm of human nature, its secrets as intricate as the lace shawl in her lap. The cooking show had brought a spotlight to its quiet lanes, but it was the same passions, envy, ambition, pride, that drove its dramas, whether on a stage or behind a garden gate. She recalled her nephew Raymond's teasing words, "Aunt Jane, you find murder in a teacup." And so she did, for in the smallest moments the truth revealed itself. She set her knitting aside, her hands resting lightly on the arms of her chair. The case had been a puzzle, its pieces scattered across the village: Clara's tart, Reginald's ratings, Elise's grudge, Sir Henry's bitters. Yet it was the human heart, with its frailties and desires, that had guided her to the solution. Miss Marple knew that another mystery would come, as surely as the seasons changed. The village, like her knitting, would always offer new patterns to unravel. The clock on the mantel chimed, its notes soft but clear, and Miss Marple rose to prepare for bed. The fire burned low, its embers glowing like the last threads of the case. She paused at the window, looking out at the village, its lights twinkling in the dark. St. Mary Mead was at peace for now, its order restored by her quiet vigilance. With a faint smile, she turned away, content that the curtain had fallen, but ready, always, for the next act to begin.